This woman flips the switch. A shark slowly descends. He was mistaken for you. And the next moment, and the audience was not afraid. Instead, he was very excited. When the platform slowly descends, sharks are like ants in its mouth. He is shy. The marine overlord Kanglong that went extinct 20 million years ago. This is Jurassic Park. 10 years ago, scientists in a piece of amber script extracted to the store of ancient dinosaurs, reused gene editing technology, and a variety of modern animal bases, reorganized edit, and successfully incubated it. The park is designed to attract attention. Let scientists create all kinds of suffering. The heroine is the head of this park. The boss came to inspect the work today. Show him the latest research on the burst Tyrannosaurus Rex. As soon as they come in, we found cracks in the tempered glass. When the boss makes eye contact with him, a sense of fear arises. He's a little concerned that the safety of the campus is not enough. I want to invite the male protagonist to come and give his opinion. The man is a retired Marine, now a dragon trainer. Then a staff member accidentally fell into the Velociraptor's park. They are all carnivores. It's about to be cut into 8 pieces. The male protagonist rushed over without hesitation and opened the door. Think, pacify son tonight. But the Velociraptor doesn't seem to be very giving. Baring teeth. Around the corner, he asked the staff to go out first. I'm slowly approaching the door. A tumble successfully escaped. This day the heroine invites. Come to the Tyrannosaurus Rex campus. But I didn't find the figure of the tyrannical dragon. Turn on thermal imaging. Didn't find it. This is the male lead who finds oversized claw marks on the wall. That means tyranny. Tyrannosaurus Rex may have escaped the park. Once you let him out, the entire island's tourists could be killed. The heroine immediately rushed to the headquarters and informed them to evacuate the tourists immediately. But according to the locator on the tyrant dragon, the tyrannical dragon in the previous life is still in the park. It seems that this guy has a very high IQ. The scratches could be his trap. This matter headquarters through the monitor. I saw the male protagonist and the staff in the park. Check the reason in the area. Never aware of the danger. Hurry up and tell them over the walkie-talkie. Berserker is still inside. But it's too late. This staff member is obese. Run more slowly. Directly grabbed by the tyrannical dragon. Then swallow. Never bring a chew. It seems that losing weight and running faster. Really important. And another employee ran out first. And closed the door. The bursting dragon is chasing after it. The moment I closed the door, he got out. The steel and cement gate can't withstand the tyrannical dragon. The male protagonist saw this and quickly hid under the car. The poaching dragon has been picked up through that narrow crack in the door. He was too scared to make a sound. Turning around, the employee is hiding in front of the car. The smell of tyrannical dragons slowly approached him. Then the car gets in the way. Slap fly. The next second, take one bite and put it in your mouth. The next target is the male lead. He cut the gas pipe with a knife. Prepare the mask. Because there's this giant thing next to him. Looking for prey. Next second, a head the size of a car is bleeding. Lying on the ground, I dare not make a sound. The gas masks the smell and it really works. successfully escaped the tyrannical Tyrannosaurus Rex's sense of smell. Now he's out of the park. All the way south, there is a gathering place for tourists. Once he gets there, it will be a massacre for everyone. And the heroine wants the staff to evacuate the tourists, but was stopped by the boss. Once notified to evacuate tourists, the reputation of the park will be ruined. Zhang, the boss, dispatched an armed team to stop the Berserker Dragon. They follow the location. A bone was found by the river. Meet Pop. Splinter has dug trace out of its body. It seems that he has a high IQ. Then a few drops of blood dripped on it. Look up. A behemoth slowly emerged. Odd, weird. Ice cream. Show her. It seems that he still has the urgency of squid. Can change color according to the surrounding environment. The reason for this is too. Humans came to exterminate their relatives. Everyone with weapons can't resist. He's like a soldier made to kill. Device. This massacre. A tragic. In a few minutes, a dozen armed squads have been wiped out. The park wanted to use him to attract people's attention and make money, but unexpectedly built a killing machine. Because he's going to kill all the lakes on the whole island. The heroine ordered the evacuation of all tourists on the island. I suddenly remembered that my two nephews were also outside, and the two brothers were affected by the poor signal on the island. Hang up the phone if you can't hear what the heroine is saying. The staff found that they were still playing in the park. The heroine asked the administrator there, "Go save his two nephews first." But the administrator said they couldn't leave. He quickly found the male protagonist. I hope he can save his two nephews with himself. Little did they know that they had been targeted by the tyrannical dragon. When they control the glass ball to escape, by the tail of the Ankylosaurus to send them flying. Tyrannical dragon sword shape first bites all the armored dragons on the side to death. Then I found my brother. The glass ball is like a basketball in his hands. Play enough and touch it lightly. It went through the bulletproof glass. Then pick up the glass ball like a dog. The brothers are about to die. Fortunately, the seat belt is loosened. Successfully escaped from the tiger's mouth. They were chased to the edge of a cliff. There's no way to go, bro. Brother pulled his brother and jumped directly. When the male protagonist and the others rushed to the cloud area, the ground is covered with dinosaur carcasses. It seems that the tyrant dragon is not hungry. It is the status of the soil here. They followed in the footsteps of Tyrannosaurus Rex. I found an abandoned base along the way. I didn't expect to bump into him. They started running away. Running in the park, the boss finally found his conscience. Fly a helicopter to the rescue. Handheld Gatlin on Tyrant Dragon. Tyrannosaurus Rex desperately flees, then smashed through the pterosaur's viewing shed. A bigger crisis has arisen. Thousands of pterosaurs escaped through the gap. Directly lose control of the helicopter. The park owner finally crashed into a cage. Suni Long flew to the tourists. Or arrest? Or humans on the ground. This woman is standing in the middle of the road. The next second, a dragon grabbed her. The male protagonist is still watching this magnificent scene. Don't get tackled by a small pterosaur. Fortunately, the heroine came to rescue him. Then the two lost nephews were found in the crowd. The male protagonist immediately took them to drive. The car escapes from this living hell. Come to the base headquarters. The boss asked him to use the Velociraptor's sense of smell. Go find Tyrannosaurus Rex first, because Tyrannosaurus will kill all foxes. So you have to hunt and kill first. Let the limbs go to the raptors before departure. Let's smell the Tyrannosaurus first. Then the iron cage was opened at the order of the male protagonist. The male lead follows closely. Not for a while. The Velociraptor stops. It seems that the violent female dragon is around here, and the Tyrannosaurus comes out. But there was no fighting between them. They communicate intimately. Male lead, guess the genes of the tyrant dragon and the Velociraptor. I didn't expect this guy. A set of puzzled dinosaurs. Talking about the Velociraptor turned. Now they are united. The target has turned to humans. The soldiers realized that something was wrong. Open immediately. Tyrannosaurus Rex repelled. But the Velociraptor is agile. They didn't see anything. Killed one by one. The team suffered heavy casualties. The male protagonist saw this and fled quickly. The heroine follows. They come into the lab. See a senior executive. We're packing up all the dinosaur DNA to create more suffering around the world. He was completely insane. Suddenly, a Velociraptor slowly walked into the laboratory. Send away Gao Bao Booter. It's so bad. The male protagonist took the opportunity to escape. Just arrived at the door. I saw 3 raptors. Waiting here for a long time. Slowly gather around. There was no attack. The male protagonist gently strokes them. It seems they remembered the male protagonist. Just then, Tyrannosaurus Rex, seeing these little ones betray themselves. He was furious. Velociraptor not to be outdone. It's better to go back. Tyrannical dragon sword attack. One slap flies one fast. The The other two also flopped. Because of the disparity in body size, they were all bitten to death in the end. To survive, the heroine runs to a gate. Order your men to open the door. He's holding a fairy wand. A behemoth in the dark was taken by a fairy stick. The heroine saw this and ran away. Led the great dragon to the tyrannical dragon realm. Sure enough, you can't be proud. No! When the two kings of the dragon meet, fight for territory immediately. Who knew that the tyrannical dragon actually fouled? Use hands and feet. Hold down the head of the Tyrannosaurus Rex. It seems that the great dragon is not as smart as him, not his opponent. Just when everyone thought there was no hope, he appeared with 6 steps. How can a king tolerate? The little one stepped on his back. Now Tyrannosaurus Rex has the opportunity to fight back. They made a perfect match. Beat the tyrannical dragon without resistance. Suddenly encountered corrosive flies. The burst dragon was dragged directly into the sea. Once the king is with me, after the battle, Tyrannosaurus Rex still wants to eat the male protagonist and the others, but was blocked in front of the Velociraptor. They exchanged a few words, and Tyrannosaurus Rex is gone. The dragon turned to look at the man, then returned to the depths of the forest. Rising sun, land overlord to the top Mutai domineering. Pledge your sovereignty. 3 years ago. Will tyrannize. Tyrannosaurus Rex dragged into the sea for 20 years. Then he has grown to 80 now. Current appetite. I guess one Tyrannosaurus Rex is not enough to plug his teeth. The escaped doctor sent someone back to the island, searching for the remains of Tyrannosaurus Rex, and successfully got the appearance. Just as they were about to retreat, a huge black shadow appeared behind the submarine. Ground crews detect loss of submarine signal. Immediately close the floodgates that control the sea. Suddenly, in the woods behind him, a cannonball. Sorry, voice. When the submarine gate is closed 54%. The controller was crushed by a foot when he climbed the plane's escape ladder. I thought I had escaped. Kanglong jumped up from the bottom of the sea. Just bite him. Subsequently, Kanglong escaped the island through the gate, flowing to the sea, officially enter the human world. After the destruction of the international park by the tyrant Wang Long, humans have since withdrawn from the island. The dinosaurs on the island lived a comfortable life as a result. But the good times don't last long. The volcano on the island may be about to erupt. If the dinosaurs were less than messengers, it will be just as it was 6,500 years ago. The dinosaur extinction is happening again. High-level human beings hold an emergency meeting for this. But the result was unexpected. They chose to let the whole fend for itself. But there's a lot of human concern. They spontaneously formed an organization. The heroine is one of the leaders. He grew up with. Long grew up together, just like your wealth at home. Please be extraordinary. That day, a rich man found the heroine. Claims to be able to put the front island under the name. Temporarily used to house the mouth. The rich man knows that the heroine was once a Jura. Director of G Park. Each dinosaur is equipped with a positioning chip. Restrictions on accessible systems. Sure enough, in the eyes of businessmen, the heroine is just a key. The female protagonist, who was kept in the dark, found the male protagonist. Invite her to find that Tencent together. This time the male protagonist didn't dawdle, because he also misses his old friends very much. The two hit it off. The rich man sent out mercenaries. Go together. Sent to protect the safety of the female protagonist and the male protagonist. But there may be a mystery. When they came to the island, they had walked for a long time. It could explode at any time. Not long after, the male protagonist passes through the lifestyle habits of the velociraptor. Found his old friend Zipan. This velociraptor is the male protagonist and has not been big since he was a child. He still remembers the male protagonist, although he is meat and animal. But in the face of the male protagonist, he still maintained a similar attitude. Just when one person and one cage are about to be intimate. An anesthetic shot on the neck of the dragon. The male protagonist was swept down in an instant. Not for what? Velociraptor chicken on time. Pounced on a mercenary. 3 or 2 bites will kill it. Can't stand them. He was soon anesthetized and fell to the ground unconscious. The male protagonist realizes that the scrap metal also drugged by a mercenary shot. Original, the plutocrats are just trying to use their authority to locate. Then pack up all the dinosaurs and take them away. Sell it to the rich as a pet. The volcano has already started to erupt. But the male protagonist is still in a coma. Suddenly, a figure appeared in front of the male protagonist. The man is slowly gaining consciousness. Triceratops can't wait. From the corner, cherish the male protagonist thoroughly. Turn him over before leaving. Then the male protagonist saw his hot eyes. It was his body. Disobey, because I was drugged before. So far the medicine has not worked. He could only twist his body desperately and crawl towards the high ground. In this way, the male protagonist narrowly escaped. At this time, the volcano has already begun to erupt on a large scale. The heroine and his companions were not so lucky. Also encountered carnivorous while fleeing. Hot lava dripped down on the 5 heads. Make him unable to approach immediately. The two were able to have a brief moment. Use a chair to climb into the escape hall. Finally escaped at the last moment. The male protagonist also escaped at this time. They ran down the mountain together. Behind them were countless fleeing dogs. The ground is also full of dinosaur corpses. Running in trio found an abandoned bachelor. But it can only be us. When people are hesitant, a pomegranate dragon appeared before them. The next second, he was bitten to the ground by the Tyrannosaurus Rex. It turns out that this is the arrogance at the top of proficiency. Looking at the rapidly spreading volcanic ash, they didn't have time to hesitate. I can only continue to escape to the beach. But soon, the male protagonist will be swallowed by the volcano of slaves. The sightseeing ball also fell into the sea. Then a lava hit the sphere, melted the glass in an instant. A lot of seawater is pouring in. In the nick of time, the male protagonist feels successfully pried open the glass door with a knife. When they swam out to sea, they found, happily, we are all being watched on Anesthesia Street. And pack it up and kill it on board. More beasts with the heart of hell. Ship each dinosaur on board. I have to pull out a tooth this year. It's getting bigger and bigger. About to devour the entire island. The three heroines fled desperately. Saw a truck halfway through. Slam on the accelerator. All the way. The appetite finally rushed to the boat. The three looked back. A giant brontosaurus let out miserable roars. Does it seem to say that I haven't uploaded it yet? Why didn't you wait for me? Then soon he was with the other dinosaurs, swallowed in smoke. Look at the scene in front of you. It's like going back 6,500 years. The god of dinosaur extinction and the ambition of the rich is far more than just selling money. He created Tyrannosaurus Rex before he found it. Let him add more powerful genes to the base. And the gene creates a head for aggression. More flexible tyrannical speed. And the male protagonist and the three of them go around in circles. Finally found it in a car. But now he was seriously injured. Fortunately, the heroine's companion was a veterinarian. After unremitting efforts, it was saved. Rapid. After the rebellion, they infiltrated the convoy. When passing through an intersection, I saw the police station not far away. I just wanted to sneak over and call the police, but was discovered by the leader of the mercenaries. Caught and locked up with dinosaurs. The dinosaurs were locked in the basement together, and the plutocrat upstairs is holding an auction fire. The rich merchants of the world gather here, because dinosaurs are creatures for them. It's a great pastime. Soon, for dinosaurs were sold for sky-high prices. They're making more and more money. The male protagonist looked at Ming Herong next door and fell into deep thought. The skull of this dragon is 25 centimeters thick. The attack power is amazing. It is known as the Iron Head Gong of Shaolin Temple. The male protagonist whistled at him from the window. Draw him to break through the wall between them. Then stand in front of the iron gate. Exist. Successfully smashed open the indestructible field. But hitting steel. Hateful. Brain seeds are also nests. At this time, the fifth set was displayed at auction. This is the pressure of the auction. Developed by Bomison. His starting price is the slightest other. More than 10 times the auction price. Claimed to be the strongest on land. Even if Tyrannosaurus Rex sees him, it won't stop. Even swords are precious. The wealthy business people are also unwilling to pay for this. The road meets the top underdog. Let out bursts of exclamations. The moderator began to introduce this explosion rapid. But he wasn't finished. A wealthy business person bid 20 million. The host directly refused. I'm not for sale, it's just a round one. Distinguish clearly. The atmosphere of the auction was instantly lifted to the next moment. And just then, Ming and Long suddenly barged in. Rampaged through the auction floor. He doesn't care how valuable you are. Dare to stand in his way, ready to be crushed. The auction house was instantly thrown into chaos. The auction was also forced to end. The wealthy business people fled the auction venue. It certainly is. Mercenaries coax me. Come in. Where does the creativity of the old man go? After seeing dinosaurs in a coma, he opens the cell door. I actually want to pull my teeth out of this cage. Suddenly, Tyrannosaurus' tail moved. He turned his head. I thought I was dazzled. Go back and continue to pull. But the streak is not short. Violent. The dragon raised its tail again and shook it, showing a smile of economic success. He suddenly stops pretending. Bite the boss's arm and raise him high. The purpose of Double Eagle is to trick a man into opening an iron door. The host hiding in the back saw being lively devoured mercenary head. He was scared to death. Hide in the elevator. He also threw out a female assistant. The female assistant screamed, but it just happened to attract the tyranny. The explosive force galloped in, running in the elevator's night hall. Just as everyone is rejoicing. The rest of my life. The Velociraptor turned to in, but accidentally broke the elevator switch. The elevator door is blocked again. Desperate cries sounded immediately, shouting and sending dummies away. The male protagonist fled like this, but was caught by the big boy Hairtail, just as they were about to kill. Rapid violence. By two of the rich man's men to death. Then face the three male protagonists and start chasing. They went into the showroom. It's dimly lit. But Tyrannosaurus has an extremely sensitive sense of smell. He can smell people around him. But I just can't find it. Sometimes, he was wondering if he had rhinitis. Just like this, one dragon and three people are transforming into a Triceratops. Peekaboo unfolds around the stone, while the two sides are deadlocked. The walkie-talkie on the ground suddenly sounded. This is it! The three could only escape again. But it didn't take long for violence to accelerate. Hiding in the well. Running in a cramped place. I can't progress with violence training. The little girl took advantage of her size to escape first. Then run to a button upstairs. Finally enter your room. But violence to plot. Highly intelligent. He witnessed that he could not enter others. He reached out and opened the balcony door with his fingernails. Don't forget to tell the little girl when you enter the door. The little girl was about to be torn to shreds. Fortunately, the man arrived in time, heading towards the tyrannical forehead and leaving under the tree. Tyrannical network conspiracy password shows weakness and lies on the ground. Otherwise, the male lead's gun will jam. He showed his murderous kindness again. Just at the moment of crisis, the Velociraptor rushed into the room. Fight with the tyrannical dragon. But the body sizes are so different. He was no match for Bao Yulong. But it also bought the male protagonist a moment to escape. Time. They went to the roof. Extinction launching and then stop. There was no escape. He decided to fight to the death. One sideways to dodge the tyrant dragon's attack. Tyrannical Velociraptor. But because the floor is too greasy, just step on the glass and fall. But the paw caught the beam. Climb soon. This time the male protagonist really has nothing to do. Just then. Fast again. And I jumped on him. Huang Liang couldn't bear their weight. Tyrannosaurus is trailed by the sharp corners of a Triceratops. Instant avoidance, and the Velociraptor stepped on him. Furious and helpless, crisis avoidable. Because of the previous fight, the accidental release was amazing. The heroine saves the dinosaur. Made a very difficult choice. He opened all the floodgates. But this is not the island. Once all the dinosaurs are released, will give humanity. The world has brought unimaginable disasters. He still didn't have the courage to open the last door. Watching dinosaurs howl in poison gas. Suddenly the door was closed. It turned out that the little girl pressed the switch. Countless dinosaur armies emerged from the Qing dynasty. Rich man and his men carried dinosaur genes. Prepare to evacuate. But the result? In an instant, there is no residue left that has been eaten. And the rich man hiding under the car is helpless. Come out and pick up the pain on the ground. Rich man never thought the largest Tyrannosaurus Rex will actually retreat. It's so bad. The Velociraptor blew. Also waiting for the male host ship at the door. Disappeared after saying goodbye to him. A dragon leapt out of the sea. Bite the fish cage and turn into the sea. The huge body actually. Ship capsized. Splashed into the sea. Since dinosaurs entered the human world. It's been for years. But humans have been unable to find the way the alliance coexists peacefully. The US government wants to change this situation. Dinosaur capture rights that will flee to various parts of the world. Awarded to Soccer, County Gene Technology Company. Let them open a dinosaur sanctuary in Bayunchi Mountain. But the CEO arrived with big ambitions. Let your subordinates use dinosaurs as guinea pigs. They wanted to extract something from the dinosaur genome, altering the genes of other animals. But it always feels like an important gene is missing. Distance to Jurassic World Park. It's been for years since the eruption. During this period, male, the master and the heroine, in order to protect the clone Ren Xiaomei, so as to live in seclusion together in this deep mountain and old forest. And since childhood, rapid and cute Xiaolon who grew up with the male protagonist and his clonal offspring. This little blue is teaching children survival skills. History. They hoisted the little plate with a trap. And Xiaolon was screaming anxiously below. Unexpectedly, poaching and driving Xiaolon. The poachers have long since escaped. And that's exactly what poachers do. Because Xiaomei's identity is special. Stay in the mountains all year round. The rebel rode him and took the opportunity. Ride her bike out to see the food outside. When crossing a bridge, a group of people walk here and wait for a long time. It turns out that Xiaomei is a care-on person. The most crucial puzzle piece of company technology. A group of people will take Xiaomei away without saying a word. Mysterious and the male protagonist is watching from a distance. It turns out they are very poaching for this business. He wants to stop. Learn to return. I grab my gear. To study Xiaomei's Jiao Xiao. But as soon as I went out, I hit the wood. Xiaolon thought it was the male protagonist. Do a comfort family mission. It stung so much that it scratched his palm. No need to rush. It's extremely busy here. Hot pot heat injury is difficult. There are even commercial ones. commercial, international airport, and that's where the poachers trade in cleanliness. Just as the transaction is about to be completed, the bodyguard of money. The poachers tried to escape. The shot opened to cages. The two imprisoned Miu Gong Huang Maru walked out. The poachers were so scared that they fell into the well. The stone dragon in the Colosseum hears movement. Escaped the hearts of poachers immediately. Fortunately, the chain wasn't long enough. This saved a life. And the men who came forward. Fortunately, even if he commits the list, how many games are entered? Take advantage of the opportunity to take down the poachers, and then fight it out in the dinosaur arena. Poachers are no match for male protagonists. Been knocked down. Dinosaurs on both sides swarmed. One left and one right bit the back and became an arm. The male protagonist took the opportunity to press each other Xiaomei. Learned that it had been taken away by thorns. He immediately put his chest. Suddenly a corpse melted. Come straight over. Vigorous and magnanimous. A red truck at the entrance of the station passes by the residential prison. The police released it on the ground. Quite specific. Drive by. Instant puncture out of control. Hit that house. For titanium thrown out of the carriage. Alloy box. The driver was seen surrounded by plainclothes police. Blonde sister called and ordered him. Open those for immediately. One by one, the pure savage Tyrannosaurs walked out. But no! Estimate, they are professionally trained. Only when infrared commands are received will attack each other. And he was chasing after his wife and children. At this time, the heroine is coming. Pick up the motor dinosaur's electric machine gun. Marry the blonde sister. The golden-haired sister calmly walked into someone else's house. Pick up the flower pot and throw it away. He pulls out his booger and puffs it. The heroine is not soft. Then come hard. Turn on the dinosaur stun gun. The super shocker repelled him in an instant. The heroine took out a photo of Xiaomei. The golden-haired sister had to be honest when she saw this. Xiaomei has been shipped to the people. Silk and Shade just dropped a savage Tyrannosaurus Rex. The new hair sister immediately marked the heroine with the chicken. When the female protagonist saw this, she immediately jumped out of the window and fled. Unexpectedly, the quality of the railing is not good. T-Rex also happens to jump over the head. He decisively let go. Get in the guy's car below and run. I met a kind chopla in the heroine. The two drove away quickly. And Tyrannosaurus is in hot pursuit. The heroine picks up the steel pipe of the car Air France. But it didn't do him any harm. He simply crossed the steel pipe. Tyrannosaurus court hit the steel pipe and passed out. And the male protagonist was also forced by the Tyrannosaurus to the golden box of Tay. They slowly enter the box. He was crying. Humble side somersault hug. Sent into the box again. Then the blonde piano suddenly turned back. Woman's figure. Tell her MEI. The male protagonist said nothing. Unexpectedly, blonde stone. Yingzhou, the outside of the rivers and lake shoots on the male protagonist. Immediately there are two leopards. One person and two dragons are speeding down the street. Fortunately, the male lead driver is highly skilled. One after another imitating the pursuit of Tyrannosaurus Rex. But when he got to the airport, the plane has been launched. Hella sees this. Drop and hide. The last time the plane leaves the ground. But there is still a Tyrannosaurus Rex. Grab him urgently. The motorcycle slid down and smashed the Tyrannosaurus down directly. It didn't take long for them to come. Request permission from the tower to land. But this is Bakian's industry. President expires, already in such activities. He ordered the bend. Released the obligation to consecrate the god. He thought the plane violated his understanding. Directly destroyed the 2 engines of the plane. Then be handsome. Falling rapidly, but there's only one ejection seat. Right in the heroine seat. After an affectionate farewell, the heroine skydived. But I met unknowingly in midair. The parachute was quickly torn apart. Falling down. And the male protagonist and Kellers are ready for transparency. Fortunately, he relies on the protagonist's light. Surrounding shadow is ruthless. They're both fine. But they weren't happy either. Class for principal. My dragon says nothing. Spin circles under them. Imagine. But accidentally stepped on it. Watch my dragons come together quickly. Come and drag the man up. My dragon is also beautiful. Facing the male protagonist. The 2 took the opportunity to climb onto the workbench. I went to Longjing Shuichi. They enter the elevator. Turn off the lights at the last minute. This woman skydived and got caught in a branch. A sickle dragon appeared behind him. He had cataracts. The eyes are not very good. Saw a Sika deer grazing. A slap flies on that fan. The female protagonist opened the seatbelt when she saw this. Fell. Climbed slowly to the pond. When the sickle dragon was about to arrive, it went in shallowly. Because of bad eyes. The heroine who couldn't see the bottom of the water roared towards the water. I left when I saw no response. Not long after, the male protagonist comes to the forest to find the female protagonist. When you see blood on the ground, and I have an ominous premonition. Get closer. Fortunately, it's a Sika deer that the sickle dragon patted flying. Suddenly, a Tyrannosaurus Rex appeared. Pick up the deer in one bite. Getting ready to eat. He looked up and saw his nemesis. Southern Giant. Food thrown by Tyrannosaurus Rex. Let's start a fierce fight with him. But it was bitten by the Southern Giant on the nose. Suddenly, I feel that he has bad breath. Go without a head. The cold wind beast picked up the Sika deer and left. And the heroine goes all the way south. We found an observatory. Suddenly, a strange shape. When the chairwoman and heroine were forced to retreat, one hand grabbed the double-tight door. It turned out to be the male protagonist, fine according to the traces of the heroine's walking. And finally, they came across a car on all fours. Officially escaped inside. Xiaomei and biologist in the laboratory. Because they escaped from Dodge's people. Gene technologies. Dodd worries about research. Decided to destroy the giant star that was developed. But not only was the Dragon King not burned to death, out of breath, bulk burning furnace. It took a while to light up the whole night. Appear as soon as we meet. Fortunately, love is only dynamic. It's you who have order to many things. People covered with cars. Slowly raise your hands with the south and look at the cats. Dodge twice. They quickly climbed up. It's Xiaomei's turn. Xiaomei quickly climbed up. But the height of the observatory and the height of the man's hand. Degree 1. Open your mouth to bite their hands. Biologists plug in a burning furnace emperor. Shes south. Just as he opened his mouth. Lost emotion. Immediately became lonely. When people hide in the observatory. He appears again. Hit to death. The heroine was caught by a wire. About to be pulled out. The machine gun woman sees the opportunity to get up. Pair the motor gun too. Is the water going to the south? Now the forest is surrounded by a sea of fire. Everywhere is incomplete. At this time, biologists think of the common people. The machine can see me. They decided to give me. Scientists are conducting in the background. The male protagonist and they all went to find Zhao Xiao. But Zhao Xiao still doesn't recognize her 6 relatives. Direct appearance. Nanju decisively injected him. Super high anesthesia. Then open the princess for society. With the power system. He looked at the flickering lights. The glass was suddenly hit to death. 3 amphibians appear. Without saying a word, it is easy to test the black error. From Kaler, who started the system to the rooftop. The plane landed on the first floor. Suddenly, this is a Tyrannosaurus Rex. Not a male ancestor. The so-called life is not as good as expected. Long disaster shot. Beauty back to shell. Tyrannosaurus Rex still falls into the lobster. After all, he is not a match for the South. Run on the ground in the dark. Aquamarine. Tiandu red. To keep the password. Everyone hurriedly got on the plane and took off. You stimulated a T-Rex with the searchlight of an airplane. He was awakened in an instant. Now a horse. Southern giant. Goal Lixiong. Tyrannosaurus Rex sword shape. Claw of life. Instantly poured out the body of the blue light behemoth. Once the king falls. The crowd also left by plane. The promise brought Zishalon back to the deep mountains and forests. He happily rubbed his mother's cheek. When the man leaves. After Zilan gave him a glance of gratitude. Back in the depths of the forest again.